Why leadership communication hardly ever works. Just getting back a couple of months in time, it was all before COVID-19 happened. I was at a corporate event, and during this corporate event, we had a presentation. We had a couple of presentations where the whole sales approach of the company was dramatically changed to what they call the New Way system. And the New Way system was all about, and then they described the detail. And I'm not going to talk about, because I know that some people will ask that. Yes, it was an all-male panel, and yes, that is a problem, but that's not the topic of the podcast today. So what happened there? People presented the New Way, and I was there to talk about leadership. Already gave my speech way before, so I am not an engineer, so I couldn't know in detail how the change will affect the business. But what I realized is that the room became very quiet, not really in a good way, and I saw some people shaking their heads, and I wondered why. But I just sat there. At the end, there was networking. I talked to a couple of people, and when the networking was over, we went to the nearest pub, and they asked me if I come over. So I said, yeah, why not? So let's go for just one drink. For the Brits who are listening, for all non-Brits who are listening to this, when British people ask you to go just for one drink, it means cancel any appointment you have next day before 10 a.m. because you won't be able to make it out of bed. So just for one drink, there we are. What happened there was when I talked to different people in the pub, I talked to different people. The youngest were in their beginning 20s, just entering the job, just had a couple of months experience, some a couple of years. Talked to people who were there for a reasonable amount of time. Also talked to people who were there for 20, 25, 30 years. These people didn't even know each other. And all of them said, the new approach is not going to work. And they told me different perspectives, and they gave me none of them was shouty or angry or frustrated. They simply said the leadership area lacks basic understanding and credibility when it comes to selling to actual clients. And they all gave me different points of view. And that was another example. Why does leadership communication often simply fail? And I'll just give you, because we always want to keep it topical, I'll just give you a couple of examples where people who have either own businesses or major brands or make their money with their brand, who just recently failed due to only what they said. So there was not even a big investment involved sometimes. People just said something and suddenly everything went south from there. The TikToker, by the way, TikTok is an app, and if you don't know what TikTok is, ask your children, they will know. And I tell you, you need to take care of TikTok right now. Remember the time when Facebook came up and we all said it's so irrelevant, and then people started to take care of it when it was way too late? And that happened with Facebook, and that happened with Instagram. As soon as something comes up and becomes a trend, our generation needs to take care of it so we're not always the last adopters and don't understand how the whole platform works. So a TikToker called Cash Baker lost 80% of his followership on TikTok. Followership means people who watch his TikTok videos, due to his statements about the LGBT community and other religions. So Cash Baker is very Christian, is a very Christian channel, which is fine. Of course, that's the usual Chumbawamba. And then they said, oh, he can't support the LGBT community because the Bible says, and he can't support other religions because they are listening to wrong prophets. Like, what the is he talking? And then, of course, he says, oh, I'm only doing this all out of love. I love all of them, but I can't support them. Gone the people were who listened to him. Another example. At the moment, we have many so-called professional speakers who use a phrase, and I quote, the virus is not the problem, the fear is the problem. Okay, listen, top tip today. The virus is the problem. That is why scientists are working on a vaccine and a cure, and not on psychological treatments, because it's not the fear which is the problem, it's the virus that's the problem. That's why it's called the COVID-19 crisis, not the fear crisis. That's why it's called coronavirus, not corona fear. Sometimes I honestly wonder who invented motivational speaking and what did we do wrong as humankind to get this on our planet. So this is, of course, motivational Chumbawamba. I know that the fear coming and psychological issues coming from lockdown and the changes in life, social distancing, these are issues, but the core and underlying problem is the virus. Full stop. There is not even a doubt about that. And always people tell you, oh, I'm only doing this to help you. And normally the next step is that you should buy something from them. They always, and that is something which many corporates and larger organizations also do wrong, they keep you at a half distance, which means they like to have you around as a client, they take your money or they take your productivity. On the other side, do they really support the issues you have? So many brands were accused of wrongdoing, and I'm going to give more examples just in a couple of minutes. The last example for how things can go wrong in leadership communication, the Sale Sharks, that's rugby, by the way. The rugby season starts. By the way, I am what I'm not going to say, because some American listeners will now say, oh, rugby, that's like American football, right? No, it's not. Absolutely not. So it is really different. So the Sale Sharks rugby, when the anthems play, some players took a knee to support the Black Lives Matter movement and others didn't. So, of course, in this case, you wonder what's happening there. And other teams, they either completely stood up or they completely had a knee. But half, basically, you just wonder what's happening here. Because the question you have now is, Black Lives Matter only for some of them? And first, of course, massive leadership failure not to talk about that before, and even worse leadership failure not to talk about it afterwards. And by the way, of course, now some people will say, oh, I support Black Lives Matter, but I think all lives matter is the right statement. Okay, just an update here. When you have a broken arm and you go to the doctor says, it's not about that bone, all bones matter. You would say, yeah, but that's not the problem here. Exactly, and that's why it's Black Lives Matter, not all lives matter. It's really simple. Also, when you see the people who screamed and shouted all lives matter, I just wonder, when refugees came over in dinghies risking their lives to get, for example, to the UK from Calais, why didn't the all lives matter people just sit at the coast helping them to get there? Why do we have the Daily Mail commentary where you see people commenting on the article about a 16-year-old dying and arriving, his dead body was found at the coast just today, and you have people commenting publicly in the Daily Mail comment section that they actually like it and they laughed about it. That's where we are as humankind. And by the way, these were the people who before shouted all lives matter. Be careful who you align with, because you have to face the consequences of that afterwards. So what happens when leadership communication goes wrong? Step one, you have a massive damage to the employer brand. And this damage will cost you a lot of money to repair. You need professional agencies, you need professional external marketing, you need professional experts for leadership, for communication, conflict management. It will cost you a significant amount of money, which will damage the business result and the profit of that year and the year after at minimum. Of course, thinking of the profit should not be the main motivation to change your behavior, but unfortunately, many leaders think of that first, and suddenly they change their behavior when they see it affects their bottom line. So first, massive damage to the employer brand. Second, you have a massive effort to repair it. And third, you don't really have a change afterwards because you only try to get away with it. I'll just give you an example. Many people say, oh, we support the LGBT community. And on the other hand, these brands sell their products to every single market where human rights, especially for the LGBT community, aren't even respected. Many brands say, of course, women have the same rights as men. Duh, obviously. At the same time, you work in places where women have to either wear special clothing or cover them up completely. That doesn't really fit together, does it? And of course, I can understand that you say you want to do trade with these countries. And of course, one reasoning can be that you say we can address the issue better when we are present in that market, which is correct, by the way. But then, of course, people will say, so how did you address the issue? Because only by selling the product, that's not really addressing the issue. That's making profit. Massive difference. So be sure that when you make a statement, you have to live up to it. Many people simply see massive damage to the employer's brand, massive investment afterwards to repair it, and then not really a change. Everything just stays as it was before. You simply try to get away with it. The main point is that many leaders are bad at handling a dilemma. And a dilemma means you have to make a statement where you are. I'll just give you an example. Apple, Google, Facebook, massive brands very clearly say they support, I'll just give you one example, the LGBT community, full stop. And when you then say, oh, I'm not going to buy an iPhone anymore because Tim Cook, who's openly gay, by the way, because Tim Cook and Apple support the LGBT community, Apple says, fair enough, goodbye. Remember that tweet when, I don't remember the brand, but one lady said, oh, I am not going to drink that tea anymore because they support Black Lives Matter, so I now have to drink PG Tips, which is another brand. And then PG Tips commented below that, we are in favor of Black Lives Matter as well, fully support that, please don't drink our tea. This is how you communicate as a leader. In a dilemma, you have to decide where you stand. You cannot please a pro-LGBT movement, which by the way, pro-LGBT, pro-Black Lives Matter, since when is it a discussion to end discrimination and racism? Do you really think we're going to discuss human rights with you? Absolutely not. Society changes in a progressive way, and you can either be part of that or you will be left behind, including your brand. So what you have to do when you have a dilemma, because I always promise in every podcast, I'm going to give very specific tips how to do it better. So now, 3 tips how to make it better when you have bad leadership communication. So step number 1, make a very clear statement where you stand. And yes, that means you can only support one side. You can't be in favor of Black Lives Matter and say all lives matter also is an option. You can't say, I'm in favor of the LGBT community, but I can understand that in different cultures they have different approaches. You cannot say, I think that women should choose what to do with their body so they can choose if they want to have an abortion or not, which by the way is common sense because no man has to tell or can tell a woman what they have to do with their bodies. You can't be on the side of the women and then say, well, I can understand that conservatives have a different approach to that and then just peddle out some pro-life propaganda. It doesn't work. So step number 1, have a very clear decision. And new brands, especially younger companies, are way better in doing that than traditional brands. This is why traditional brands often struggle and have the damage they have. So step 1, make an unambiguously clear decision. That, by the way, is a massive problem in many organizations. People say no one decides here anymore because they all fear that they are wrong. Being wrong is part of the game. That's why you have a higher position in the hierarchy. That's why you get more money. When you're wrong, you admit that you were wrong and then you learn something from it. And by the way, that is a culture which you need in your organization. The wrong culture is when everyone simply escalates something, always gives it to the next higher level in the hierarchy. And at the end of some ridiculously long and slow chain, someone has to decide because they're sitting at the end of that chain and they have to decide without knowing what it's about, without knowing the details they need to know, and without knowing who are the people involved. And then they make a horribly and ridiculously bad decision. Like that organization about changing the sales system I told you in the first place. So how to do it better? Step 1, clear decision. Document very well who is going to decide what. And then you have to make them prevent. Then you have to prevent that they pass it on to someone else. They have to decide. Step number 1 is make the clear decision. Step number 2, remove people who don't align with your values. So when people say, oh, I don't think we should support Black Lives Matter movement because, we have conservative clients, but you decided to support Black Lives Matter, then that person being against that, by the way, that person basically says human rights are up for negotiation. Not cool. These people have to leave. Remember when Mark Zuckerberg had Facebook and they were sitting together because Yahoo made them an offer to buy Facebook, and in the room they decided by a raise of hands not to sell. Mark Zuckerberg fired everyone that was in favor of selling Facebook at that point because he said, you are not on the mission anymore. That is a very harsh decision, but it is the right one. So step number 1, clear decision. Step number 2, remove people who go against your values and clearly don't belong in your organization anymore. And step number 3, make sure that it's follow-up. You can't do a pro-LGBT thing only during Pride Month. You can't do something pro-women only during International Women's Day. People realize that. And it's nearly comical how ridiculous some people are about trying to be part of a movement which they clearly are not part of. It remembers me of, I think the chain is called Chick-fil-A, who supported massively far right-winged organization, extremely conservative. Then they realized suddenly in all major cities, people don't go there anymore because they don't want to have these backward-facing brands. Then they did a bit like rainbow flags out there. It's it's like putting up a rainbow table somewhere at your convention and thinking you solve the problem by just doing so without removing the people who offended the values of your organization in the first place. Only really poor leaders do that, and only really incompetent leaders do that. So people who go against your values need to leave, and you can't have an organization that just jumps on their stance, jumps on their point of view when it comes to moral ethics and values every time they try to adopt to someone else. So step number 3 is be sure that this line is followed up, because otherwise you have a change in leadership, which may happen from time to time, of course, because CEOs, etc., senior management, they change. And you can't just run that direction and then some person changes and then you run the other direction. This, of course, can happen when you have to serve the market in a different way. So when, for example, we have more digitization, you suddenly need online shops, etc., etc. This is something completely different. I'm not talking about disruption. Moral and ethics hardly ever change disruptively. So the 3 tips how to make it better when it comes to leadership communication. Step number 1, make a very clear decision, and that means some people will not be happy with your decision. You can't please them all. Step number 2, remove people who go against the values of your organization. And step number 3, you need to be sure that this line of moral outlook, this line of values, the consequences will be in place for a long time, because leadership communication is a long-term game. And this is why you have to start right now. I wish you all the best implementing this in your organization. And for today, I can only say thank you very much for your time.